Hello there and welcome to the fourth in, well, what was supposed to be an occasional series of Financial Fair Play podcasts, which has actually become a fairly regular series of Financial Fair Play podcasts. I'm James Marriott from the Wednesday Week. As ever, I am sat in my kitchen in Sheffield. James Allen from Owls Americast is normally joining us from the sunny climes of New York, but you're actually about a mile up the road from me at the moment, James.
I'm joining you from the climes of Ringlow Road, so sort of about a mile above Sheffield on the basis of the way my calves feel after jogging back up there after borrowing a microphone from you, James. So thank you for the supreme audio collection that we're working on this evening. It's going to be a whole lot of fun talking into my iPhone.
It's great. You miss out the fact that I lent you a microphone that is only compatible with Macs, but didn't check with you whether or not you were actually going to be using a Mac. And of course you're not, so it didn't work. So there we go. The idea was right. You've just come back from Spain, where has it been the hottest week ever in Europe or something?
Literally the hottest week ever recorded in Spain. Now, Peter, I know you're a statistician, so I was trying to get some information on this. Was it actually the hottest temperature ever recorded in Spain, or the hottest continuous average temperature over 7 days, or the lowest minimum temperature over 7 days? Apparently it was just chuffing hot, which I can attest to because I'm about a third of the body weight I was when I went out there a week ago, just on the basis of pure sweat exerted.
Brilliant. So Peter Løhmann is joining us from Denmark, where has it hit kind of 40 odd degrees in Denmark yet?
No, we've reverted to what we call summer in Denmark, which is pretty much autumn everywhere else. So it's been raining all day, and it's about 14 degrees Celsius now. So it feels better. So now we can complain about the rain all the time, considering we've had some of about 1.5 months of bright sunshine, and now we get to complain about the rain again, which feels good.
Exactly the same here. It's done nothing but rain pretty much all day. It's been a very wet, windy Sunday in Sheffield. Right then, so we are here to talk about the finances in the wonderful world of Sheffield Wednesday, and of course it's been quite a busy week all in all, which is why we're back together doing the fourth in our specials on this subject. So Monday was the fans forum at Hillsborough. And probably no great surprise that it was confirmed that we're in a transfer embargo of some sort and have been since April. This was kind of, fitted in with all the kind of predictions and whatnot that we'd made. I was a little surprised about the fact that this is since April. What were your kind of your reactions to that, Peter? What did you think?
Well, if you look at the EFL regulations, it does state that the accounts for the current year and the two following years have to be in by the end of March 31st. So, as soon as the EFL had received our accounts and our predictions for the next couple of years, they would have slammed an embargo on us, or at least refused to register any new players for us. So that pretty much tells you that we were probably at that point quite far away from satisfying the limit of the 3-year running losses that we had at that time, and I guess the period since has been spent trying to convince the EFL that we will be working towards reducing that in the current season, so that by the end of the current season we'll be within the allowed loss of £39 million for the last 3 seasons.
James, obviously, with you being away on holiday, you weren't on the Owls Americast this week, so this is kind of the first chance that you've had to sort of react to what was talked about at the fans forum on Monday. What was your take? Was anything that particularly surprised you?
Well, I think I was probably actually a little bit more surprised by the fact the embargo goes back to April than maybe Peter is. I mean, I think, as we found out over the course of these episodes, Peter knows the regulations inside out and probably had an even greater expectation. I think, to be honest, we all knew we were sailing close to the wind this summer, but we thought maybe that there was, work ongoing to position us such that we would be able to trade. It just tells you that we're in a worse situation than even I think we predicted, 3-4 months ago when we started these conversations, and that's quite galling and concerning, not least because of what we're seeing as a result of the lack of squad turnover, at least on the inward sense that we're able to get to. What I think probably surprised me most, though, was the commentary in terms of what happens next summer. So, I think as we'll get into the conversation just now, a lot of people were kind of left scratching their heads about a few comments that were made about just the stakes that we're in terms of, not so much what we do now while we're under embargo, but what could happen to us if we aren't able to sort out our football finances over the next 12 months when we come into next summer. And the stakes that Mr. Chansiri positioned in terms of, if we don't get promoted this year, well, we could talk about the footballing side, and probably the evidence is there that we may not get promoted this year. The stakes are extremely high when it comes to what may happen in terms of our ability to renew the squad in 12 months' time, let alone this summer.
Yeah, obviously there was a lot talked about on Monday, but very little in terms of the specifics, which is why we kind of thought, it was right for us to get back together and try and figure out maybe what wasn't said on Monday, but kind of what we need to know. So you mentioned there about looking forward to next summer, and the language used by Mr. Chansiri when he was talking about this was some of the most explicit language that is used, because in the past, whenever I've been to steering group meetings or fans forums, he's tended to play down financial fair play and said, it'll be fine, we'll sort things out. This was the first time he kind of said, if we don't get promoted this season, we're in big trouble. He didn't kind of go into any detail about what that really is, which I know something we're going to talk about and try and figure out what those possible scenarios are going to be. But did either of you two particularly pick up on that? The fact that there seemed to be a marked change in the language used by the chairman when he was talking about this.
I think you have to separate reality from communication here. I think Chansiri wanted this fans forum as a way of creating a wake-up call for all Wednesday fans, and wanting to control what was said about the situation we're in. And there's a clear strategic advantage to playing up the scope of what might happen in the summer for him, because if we think that we're essentially all gonna die in the summer, then some of the decisions that we have to make regarding players being sold and so on will probably go down a lot easier with fans. Whereas if he said that we'll sort it out and then he sells players and people are left with the impression from the fans forum that he wouldn't, then he would be in a lot more trouble. So if you play up the scope of what might happen, and then it ends up being probably less than that, it's usually a better situation, and it's often seen in politics as well. Actually, I work in the public sector, and every time we have to make big cuts, the politicians will usually go out and say, the cuts are going to be like 500 million, and then they end up being 300 million. Everyone pretends it's like we didn't have to save any money anyway, because the net feel of it, or the relative feel of it, is we didn't have to save the 200 million. It's not that we are saving 300 million. So I think it's kind of the same with Wednesday here. It's Chansiri trying to like shake some realism into us as a fan base, and I think he realizes there are no easy ways around it now. Whereas before he might have thought that he could channel money into the club in other ways, and have that allowed, but maybe what's happened since March has been the EFL refusing some of the revenue streams that Chansiri has tried to create from his own family funds and all that, and that might have been the reason he's changed his tone of voice as well in this.
Peter, can we just pick up on that? So there's 2 points that I want to kind of address there, and I'm going to come to the question of revenue first, and then James, I'm going to circle back to your question in terms of surprise around Mr. Chansiri's comments themselves. So, when we've done these analyses in the past, and when, Peter, we've talked about the numbers that you've produced, the assessment here is on the accumulated loss over 3 years. In other words, the adjusted loss for financial fair play based on the accounting loss, but with certain provisions. When we've looked at this, we've always assumed that there was a proportion of our revenue which was allowable on the basis of what's called fair market value. In other words, assessing that, sponsorships, stand sponsorships, shirt sponsorships, the other ways in which revenue is brought into the club, possibly an own branded football shirt, for example, were going to be accepted on the basis of FMV, fair market value. It's come to light over the last few weeks that the EFL have been particularly hard on looking at sources of revenue that come from associated parties, so owners, family members, related business interests, etc. Is what you're saying there, Peter, that you suspect that our revenue line has probably been squeezed in the EFL assessment, and that's probably led to a harsher than perhaps the club anticipated loss on the rolling basis?
Yeah, I think that could be the case. It's probably not going to be. It's not going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I don't think the amount is going to be big enough, but it closes down an avenue for Chansiri to. I mean, if it was allowed, he could probably try to increase that as a revenue stream in the future, and then he could see a way out of this. But if they clamp down on it on the accounts that we've already handed in and the accounts for last season. He knows that he can't boost it, and he's going to struggle to find any other revenue streams that he can boost easily for this season, especially considering the average attendance is probably going to go down this season. So I think that's part of the reason, but I think the main reason is the loss we were having regardless. I mean, even if the revenue streams were allowed, we would still be in quite considerable problems. So it might have increased with problems with about 20%, but the big part of the problem was already there, even with Chansiri's fake revenue streams or whatever you want to call it.
Adjusted revenue streams. Quick statement here of kind of the obvious. The real problem here is that there is a limit. Well, whether you call it a problem in fairness or a problem in the way the regulations work, there is a significant limit on how much one owner can pump into their own club. So, Mr. Chansiri wants to put more money in, but the regulations are preventing him from doing that, whether that's through straightforward cash injection, shareholder, raising new share options, etc., or whether it's through other means, i.e. sponsoring the shirt, etc. That there's a real clampdown on that. I guess where you're hitting though, Peter, is that the real problem is that massive loss that we made in 2016, 2017. So we know accounting wise that was close to 20 million. When it's adjusted downwards, it's a number somewhere between probably 15 and 20. I guess, James, coming back to your original question, the thing that really surprised me about the comments on Monday night was that it's probable that we are close to that figure again in 2017-18 because, frankly, not much change. We probably hit about the same in terms of revenue maximisation, and we probably didn't change the cost base significantly. In fact, the only cost base changes that have probably been realised have been through the last few weeks of the window, where Jordan Rhodes has gone off the books, Jack Hunt has gone off the books. We won't feel the impact of that until the 18-19 accounts. But even with those two shifted, it's a couple of million off. It's not the 10 million off that we'd need to fall inside the 39 million over 3 years, but we're already in breach over 2 seasons as it stands. So what really kind of alerted me to his then comment that you're talking about, James, where he said that things could be really stark next summer, is the reality is we are probably going to be well in excess of breach next summer. And that means that we will be under embargo for several windows unless we make some very material changes to the revenue that we're bringing into the club. And that could lead us to having to not only sell off players, but not being allowed to re-sign players. And if you look at the number of out-of-contract players next summer, that's a really daunting prospect when you then think that your hands are tied to try and replace them.
Yeah, definitely.
Peter, you picked up on something that was said on Monday that didn't really make sense to you, which was with regards to, while we're under this embargo of whatever sort, Mr. Chansiri mentioned that the club are unable to extend the contracts of existing players until literally the point that their contract has run out. Now, you were kind of suggesting you weren't really sure whether or not that was correct or that was right.
Yeah, the reason I picked up on it is because the old FFP rules that were in place before 16-17, they had they quite clearly stated what happened when the club was placed under transfer embargo. But of course, after the profitability and sustainability rules from 16-17 that were put in place then, there aren't like a standard sanction when you break the allowed loss. There are all sorts of sanctions. And one of them actually is that the EFL board, I can't remember the exact line, but it's something like the EFL board can, disciplinary commission can decide whatever sanction for however long and in whatever shape or form they want to. So I mean, there's nothing stopping them from telling us we can't re-sign players until their contracts are up. What that tells us, though, if that is the case, and I mean, I have no reason to doubt that it's the case if that's what Chancellor Katrin Meyer is saying at the fans forum. But if that is the case, that is an escalation of the sanctions towards us, and it's the way I analyze it anyway. It's quite a worrying sign, because that tells you the EFL does not trust us to reduce our costs effectively, and wants us to shift a lot of the players we have out of contract next summer, which includes Barry Bannon and Lucas Shaw, for instance. So it's, and Gary Hooper as well. So it's for me, that's really a worry, because that tells you the EFL still does not trust us to raise enough money or reduce our costs enough to stay within the limit. And the last numbers I did, our 3-year loss at the end of this season, the current season, will be around 51 million, and we allowed 39 million. So we're about 12 million away from hitting the number we need to hit. And I mean, we saw the transfer window. We raised about maybe 2.6 million with the 2 transfer deals, and then we saved some wages as well. But it's not going to be enough. And I mean, it's quite another worry that Kieran Westwood wasn't sold permanently before the permanent transfer window closed, because it's quite clear that he's, as we were actually touching on all the way back in January, February, when we did the first podcast, he's probably one of the most, I think it's probably the best option to move him on, and it seems like the club agrees with that. And the fact that we didn't move him on for a transfer price is quite a worry, because I can't really see how we're going to raise £12 million before the end of the season. It's important to remember, though, next summer, when we do transfers next summer, all the way up to the end of July, we can do transfers that will count towards this current season. So it's not like when the season finishes and we haven't sold enough players that they'll put the hammer down on us from the EFL. We'll actually be able to do trades during the next summer to be able to raise that amount. But it's a hell of a bad situation to be in, because every club around the country and abroad will know we need to raise some money. So obviously they'll offer us a pittance for some of the players we think are really saleable, like Forestieri, for instance. Instead of getting a good value for our players, and we'll probably also struggle to re-sign some of the players. I mean, someone like Barry Bannon, it's very admirable that he said he wants to finish his career with us and get a new contract. But if I was in his shoes and I wanted to look at my career, I'd probably take the free transfer somewhere else and play in a team that can play for promotion, because he's good enough for that. So that's really what I get from it. I mean, at the time when it was said, I was puzzled by it, but then I looked a bit into the regulations, and actually they are quite potentially quite far-reaching, and a lot more far-reaching than if you just glance at them. If you need to read a bit between the lines, really, and the EFL can pretty much do to us what they want to. The idea that we are an independent business running independently is really a bit of a smokescreen, to be honest.
So, Pete, that's interesting, Pete, because the analogy I used, and don't take this too literally, is that, we're kind of like a business that's been put into receivership, right? So we are no longer our board, our executive team is no longer trusted to run the business as a going concern. We've been put in the hand of a set of receivers, accountants, basically, to make sure that the creditors get paid. Now, the really difficult part about this, and where it really gets to the bone, is Sheffield Wednesday Football Club is a loss-making enterprise, but most football clubs are. So let's cast us as an exception here. Nope. Sheffield Wednesday Football Club has fallen afoul of the financial rules that have been set by the custodians of the league that determine whether or not you can participate. So we are only in default by the judgment of the English Football League. But because they are essentially the be all and say all of the organisation of participating in the championship, we are now forced to be, to large extent, run by their decisions, and we lose a lot of control. And those, unfortunately, are the rules. It's a shocking situation to be in, because we are perfectly financially capable of underwriting our own operations, of Mr. Chansiri continuing to put in his own money and fund future transfers to replace those that we want to move on. But that's the situation that we have to accept, is the league are going to take a very, very high level of control and approval over our decisions over the next 12, 18 months.
Okay, I think at this point is where I need to drop in our usual disclaimer about the fact that none of us particularly claim to be experts on this subject, but we spend a lot of time talking about it between ourselves. Peter particularly spends a lot of time looking at figures and doing very complicated sums on spreadsheets that make no sense to me, but somehow a figure comes out of the other end. So far as well, we've generally been fairly close to getting most things right in terms of the numbers and how things are likely to pan out. Now, I mention all that because I think this is a good opportunity for us to kind of have a bit of a think about, let's say, the next 12 months and what scenarios there are that could play out. Now, dealing with the here and now, we suspect, although we've not got anything official on it, we suspect that we didn't have the transfer embargo removed before the end of the transfer window. The noises on Monday were that the chairman and the chief exec were confident that would happen before the end of the transfer window, but it didn't. There's obviously still a chance that it might happen before the end of August, which allows loan moves and other things to become a possibility. The next real key thing though here is January, isn't it? Because that's when we're likely to know what kind of a season that we're having. So if Mr. Chansiri, as he suggested on Monday, is kind of pinning his hopes on promotion this season, and that gets us out of this great hole, which would be wonderful, and absolutely all the conversations that we've had become completely irrelevant because they just won't matter anymore. In January, obviously, we'll kind of have a bit of an idea as to whether or not it's likely to be a promotion season, and I think, as we've all agreed, let's not debate the likelihood or otherwise of that too much on this podcast, although certainly on the basis of Saturday, I think in my head I've got a fair idea as to what kind of a season this is going to be. Let's say that promotion is not looking likely in January. Peter, do you think that this kind of idea of a flash sale of 3 or 4 of our big name players going is that a possibility? Is that even a likelihood in January?
Yes, definitely. The good thing about the January window is you'll have a lot of clubs who are more desperate for players and know where they're lacking. Some will be struggling with like in relegation battle when they didn't expect to, and some of them will probably be chasing promotion or be chasing championships or be chasing European places in the Premier League and so on, and that all that adds up to there's some analysis done by some quite good people who sussed out that it's about 10-15% more in transfer fees in the January window than in the summer window. So that works in our favour, you could say. But take, for instance, Fernando Forestieri. His contract is up in the summer of 2020. So in January, he'll have a year and a half left on his contract. If we want to sell him, and if you don't do it January, if you sell him in the summer, next summer instead, you'll probably get a lot less for him because he'll have a year left on his contract. As we saw with Jack Hunt, for instance, that reduces the value quite significantly. And as we saw with Kieran Westwood, there's probably likely to be quite a few clubs who think, well, we don't need him now, so we might as well wait the season and get him for free. But let's say we're in about 14th, 13th place, way off the playoffs in January, and Forestieri scored 10 goals in the first part of the season and been our standout player, which is already looking quite likely. That will increase his value. So it could be that selling him solves pretty much the problem, depending on the transfer we get, of course. As I said before, it's between 11 and 12 million pounds we need to raise. So if we sell him for say £8 million. That's and his wages goes off the books as well. That's about £9.5 million we save. So that's definitely a possibility. And the further problem really is if some of the players that we need to renew the contract of. I mentioned again, we got Gary Hooper, we got Barry Bannon, Lucas Shaw, Kieran Lee. They all have contracts that are running out in the summer, and they have 6 months left of their deals in January. If you can't offer them a new contract because you're under the transfer embargo and you're under the specific ruling from the EFL that you cannot re-sign players' contracts before they run out. Well, I mean, do you bet the house that Barry Bannon is true to his word and signs a new contract in the summer, or do you move him on for probably quite a small fee, but you still get a fee from it? And I mean, it doesn't affect your season, because if you're 12th or if you're 16th and you're quite safe from relegation and you're far away from the playoffs, it doesn't really matter. You're mid-table. So it might if he leaves in the summer anyway, it might be better to move him on then, which is a really horrible thing to say, because we'd all love Barry Bannon to continue to be a Wednesday player, and the same obviously for Forestieri. But these are the options we're pushed into. We're pushed into a corner, and we're not going to talk our way out of it. That's for sure. That's become quite clear for. I think a lot of Wednesday fans had a wake-up call at the fans forum, and it's. I feel like a bit like one of those guys who predicted the financial crisis, because it's like a vindication, because we sort of predicted this stuff on the podcast, but it just feels really shitty being right in this situation.
That's a fair point. One of the, I mean, on the last podcast that we did talking about this, one of the things that we discussed and talked about was Fernando Forestieri. Particularly thinking about whether or not loaning him out would be a sensible option. And I think fair to say that's an opinion that really divided fans. We got a fair bit of stick for suggesting that as a possible route out of this. And again, there where we talk about how we get ourselves out of the hole that we're currently in, it was the first name that obviously you mentioned, Peter, and it's a name that comes to mind a lot. We're reminded of the fact that he obviously was probably man of the match on Saturday against Hull. Scored a great goal at Wigan as well the week before. It's a really motive subject for fans. Is there a way out of this that doesn't involve us looking at selling Fernando Forestieri? James, what do you think? Do we have much in the way of other assets that can get us out of what is clearly a difficult situation without having to lose our star player?
Well, there is an obvious way out, and it's called get promoted this season.
Yes, let's take that option. We'll do that. Sorted. Great.
We could devote an entire podcast to how. I think you probably did in midweek. I think our guys did as well. I mean, listen, the reality is, Fessy is the one player that we have who is probably a box office revenue earner. In the sense both of being a big signing for another club and a big revenue generator for us if we sold him. We get into a 1 equals, I don't know, 2 or 3 parts if you start looking at other players to acquire the same sort of income from transfer revenue coming inwards. So Adam Reach is an obvious example. I think would easily generate the same amount of money that we paid for him. And I know that's a contested figure, but his performances last season, I think he proved himself to be a very reliable Championship performer. And maybe we bring in 5-6 million maybe in a good market. He's certainly under a longer term contract as well, which helps. You look at some of the youngsters as well. There is a bit of a theory beginning to build in my mind that part of the way in which the club is approaching the goalkeeping situation is thinking, can we put a couple of these goalkeepers in the shop window, and because of the premium they have on their age, will that help us when it comes to having to think about tradability? Could a Jordan Thornley or an Ash Baker having an outstanding season? Certainly they look better than the incumbents in left and right wing back respectively on Saturday. Could they become saleable assets? This isn't a nice conversation to have, but you're looking at 2 or 3 of those players to match up to losing a Forestieri, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, Peter, how do you genuinely think this is going to play out? Because clearly the next 12 months are going to be 12 months of change in some way or another. A lot of players who are coming to the end of their contract. Let's say that we do decide that we're going to let those contracts run out, we're going to let those players move on somewhere else. We've got to therefore bring in enough money to also be able to rebuild the squad. Is that going to be an easy sort of process, or I guess what I'm getting at is, once we've got this 12 months out of the way, is it plain sailing from here on in, or can you see a turbulent future ahead after that?
Well, if you look at the figures, which is my preferred way to approach this situation, if we don't do anything, if you just let the contracts run out, it's gonna bring down the costs remarkably. It's about more than £10 million in saved wages from this season, 18-19, to next season, 19-20. It also leaves us with 17 players, 7 or 8 of which are youngsters at the moment, or on youth contracts anyway. And you'll have the absence of Barry Bannon, obviously, and Shaw and Gary Hoop and et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the losses for the last season, it's probably going, as James said, it's probably going to be around the same figure as 16-17, which, adjusted for the allowed expenses we have, it's in the profitability and sustainability world, it's probably going to be around 80 million as well. Now, this current season, 18-19, our losses, in my calculation anyway, is going to be around 15 million. So if you add those two together, and you add 19-20 on as a third season, you're allowed to make a loss of 39 million for those 3 seasons. In my calculations, 19-20 is going to give us a loss of 3 million, even with all those players leaving and getting off the wage bill. It's still going to be a loss of around 3 million. So what we have over, you have to imagine now, we have a squad of 17 players, around 8 of which are young youth players. Ash Baker, Thornley, etc., but still inexperienced youth players at the moment. And what you have over under the FFP limit is about £4 million, and that's the money we have to spend on new players in 19-20. This is all providing that we can get to spend that money, because if we don't do anything about this, we just say, well, screw the EFL. They're telling us to reduce our costs, but to the tune of 12 million and raise some transfer funds. We're not going to do that. We're just going to see how it pans out. They put us on a transfer embargo. We can't actually sign those players to replace the players that are leaving this summer at the end of their contracts. So you might be able to sign some players, but if the EFL is not going to register them, you can't play them in the Championship. So it's not really a scenario, as I see it, to just say to hell with it. We're not going to do anything. So I think it's a fair assessment, as you said before, that Chansiri is probably at the moment trying to wait it out until January. And if we are, as I and by listening to you two, you agree, we're unlikely to be anywhere close to the playoffs come January. I think Chansiri will have to have his hand forced, even if he doesn't want to, and he has to break up the squad and sell what he can to try and be in a situation next summer, 19-20, for the 19-20 season, where we can actually build a team that at that point, if we don't do anything, we'll be having a team where we might struggle to stay in the league. So we'll have to sell players to be able to actually make a decent team for 19-20 that can perhaps sneak into the playoffs. But this is not. I don't foresee this to be a situation that is just gone in the season. It'll take a few years rebuilding, because the players we especially because we don't have a lot of money to spend on players, we'll have to be smart in the transfer market. And if you look at some of the clubs in the Championship this season, they're signing a lot of players from League One, League Two, even non-league players, even down in the 7th tier, 8th tier, and whatever. We're not really. I think we're looking at it. We have trialists from those divisions, but we really have to increase our scouting and get smart in the transfer market, because a lot of the signings we've made, probably about 2/3 of the signings we've made since Chansiri came in, haven't been a profit-generating move. And no, football isn't about making a profit, and Wednesday's history tells you that. But you need to be able to have a flow of players. So you buy a player at an earlier point of his career, keep him for 2-3 years, let him build his value, maybe even double it, then you sell him on, and then you buy a new younger player for low fee, but build him up as well. Essentially, that is Brentford's entire business model, and they do it really, really well. And we don't have to do it as well as they do, but I can't see any way around it other than doing it that way, because that's the only revenue stream we could really build, because Chansiri can't spend any more money, but the revenue stream we can build is buying players at a low value and then selling them at a high value, essentially playing the market, you could say.
I mean, to be fair, Peter, we did sign Morgan Fox from League One. Sorry, I had to introduce a moment of levity. You're absolutely right, and I think we've gone the long way round of really explaining the one statement from Monday night that gave us all, hairs on the back of our necks and made the whole fan base stand up, which was, if we don't get promoted this year, we will be in real trouble next season. You've just outlined why we'll be in real trouble next season, because we'll be struggling to put together a squad that can compete in the Championship in 1920 under the current trajectory. But the other part of the statement, which I find fascinating, is that if we don't get promoted, our chairman still believes this is a squad capable of getting promoted. He believes in the players that were signed. And, if we are utterly ruthless in our assessment, we've spent a lot of money and we've had some very questionable returns on that investment. If you were looking at this as a portfolio manager, looking at the investment choices that somebody had made, you wouldn't be re-employing them, certainly wouldn't be reinvesting your funds, because we haven't brought those players that can be moved on at a higher profit. We haven't brought the high-priced players who've then delivered on the football field. We've brought a lot of players who've spent a lot of time sitting on the sidelines and players who've made a middling contribution, and that is why we are where we are. That's where the costs go.
Okay, this is kind of speculative stuff, but I suppose this question for you, Peter, really. How long do you think it's going to be before we are back at the table in terms of signing players and building a new squad? Because it isn't as simple as we sort it out in the summer and that's it, everything's fine again. It's going to be a while, isn't it? At what point do you think that we will find ourselves in a place whereby we're really competing again?
Well, I think if we get to a situation, say the scenario that plays out is we sell Forestieri in January and pretty much close the hole and satisfy the EFL, and the EFL then says, okay, you can re-sign players now for contract. Because if we do sell Forestieri, then that 12 million that we're missing, and say we close that hole, that 12 million goes into to the pot for the 1920 season. So we actually have quite a lot of money to re-sign the players. We want to re-sign Bannon and Shaw, especially, but we also have quite a lot of money over to actually spend on players. So what I'm trying to get at here is, if you choose the inaction route, which is what Chansiri is saying now, and he's hammering his hopes to the massive promotion. If you go that route, you're essentially saying that next season is a write-off or a likely relegation scenario, fight scenario. Whereas if you go the route where you rebuild in January, raise the funds you need, and then set yourself up for a decent summer where you can sign a new squad and get some young players in, young hungry players in that will be on a lot lower wages than the Premier League outcasts we've been prolific in signing in the last couple of seasons. If you do that, then I think we'd actually be in a good position even for 1920. But it all rotates around the choice of having to trade in, as it were, one star player for a team, essentially. And I mean, as good as Forestieri is, he isn't worth more than the team, and he isn't worth more than Wednesday's championship status, is he? So if let's say we do move Forestieri on in January, and we do get a decent fee for him, and we do pretty much make the hole go away. This is definitely the optimistic scenario. There are lots of caveats to it that means it probably might not work, but let's just go play with the idea. Then if we do move him on and we spend this money wisely in the summer, we might have a next season where we'll be close to the playoffs, and the young players will be developing really well. And then for the start of the 2021 season, we'll be seeing quite a strong team, because we've actually built the team ourselves, and there'll be a good understanding between them. And if needs be, if we want to sign a star player, we can move some of our young players on as well.
Okay, I mean, there is one other potential scenario that would completely get us out of jail free, as unlikely as it may be. But it was discussed on Monday, the idea of the fact that the club are really trying to push to actually change the rules. James, what do you make of this? So Catherine Mier was talking about the fact that they tried to get support from the rest of the league to change the current rules about profit and sustainability. Obviously, it didn't gather the amount of support that it needed to go through. Can you see that ever happening? Do you think? I think it's 18 out of the clubs in the league that would need to support the idea of changing the rules. At the moment, obviously, there aren't, because there's enough clubs that still believe that the current system suits them. Can you see a point whereby that might change?
In a word, James, no. Unfortunately not. I mean, and for the simple reason being that, for that magic number of 18 to be hit, you've got to have enough clubs who have been outside the big time and basically been either on the verge or in Wednesday's situation to vote with you. The difficulty is the Championship has a significant number of clubs now who are recent or very recent ex-Premier League clubs who are enjoying parachute payments. And, quite frankly, voting to abolish FFP, or profit and sustainability, as it stands now, would undermine their competitive advantage. They would suddenly be faced with a lot of high-spending peers in the division who could match their ability in the transfer market with the Premier League riches they come down with. And I just think it's very unlikely to see that bolus of clubs, some of which came down in the last couple of seasons, but there's plenty like Villa who've been knocking around here for now 2-3 years who see that as their ticket back to the Premier League. The other part, and Peter might be better placed to comment on this from a regulatory point of view, is whether it is true to say that only the Championship clubs get to vote on this, because obviously profit and sustainability affects the whole EFL. In other words, the rest of the 3 leagues below the Premier League. So I'm not absolutely certain that the statement that it would just take the 18 Championship clubs to come on side is accurate. But I certainly don't see it happening in a window that would benefit us going into next summer.
No, I agree with the assessment, and I was a bit puzzled about the 18 out of 24 as well, because the way I read it, and I mean, I'm just a layman here. I'm not apart from not being an accountant, I'm not a lawyer either, so I don't actually know whether this is true or not. But it looks like it's the 72 who decide these things. But it might be that the 18 clubs needed from the Championship is just to put the motion forward for all the EFL clubs to vote on. But just to try to be positive on this, I mean, profitability and sustainability was put in place in 16-17. It actually replaced FFP, which was a lot stricter. So there is a precedent for the rules being a lot less harsh than they are now, because before 16-17 you only allowed a loss of £8 million a season. There was no 3-season role or anything, and that was obviously increased to 13 million per season, which is then added up to the 39 million for 3 years. So I mean, there is a precedent, and you could actually see in this season we have quite a high number of clubs that are going for it. And I mean, Forest is one, Leeds is another. You have the clubs coming down from the Premier League also going for it. And there, if either Forest or Leeds do succeed, it'll probably embolden other clubs to try this route as well, because it might be the magic way to the Premier League and land of riches. So that could be that number of clubs struggling in the same situation as us and Birmingham at the moment could increase over time, and it might also be that the EFL and actually the EPL get involved as well, because the only reason we aren't really struggling financially is we get £7 million a year from the Premier League as a solidarity payment. Quite an ironic name, but it's a third of our revenue we get from the Premier League as a sort of in Denmark we call it a shut up sweet, which is a giant piece of hard candy that you put in the mouth of kids to make them shut up, and that's essentially what the Premier League is giving us. And as long as the Premier League has that on us, so to speak, the Premier League is going to have a sort of like an invisible hand to play in the EFL's regulations, because obviously if the EFL vote in a way that puts the clubs relegated from the Premier League at disadvantage, the Premier League might say, well, if that's what you're going to do, then screw your solidarity payments. You can pay for yourself, and then half a third of our revenue goes away. And obviously the owners will then have to stump up that cash, even in a situation where there aren't any regulations telling you how much you can lose. So, I mean, I'm trying to be positive. I'm trying to think that we might actually be able to change this, these regulations, and one obvious way to do it. And this is probably fairy tale land, but if the obvious way to do it for me would be to say that the parachute payments do not count towards the revenue under FFP or PNS. So you take that £41 million away, which is the money they get the first year after they're relegated. And even then, most of these clubs coming down from the Premier League won't struggle financially. They'll still be within the limit because they allowed higher losses as it is compared to us. I mean, Stoke, after the season, they allowed a loss over 3 years of £83 million. Our allowed loss is £39 million. And they get the £41 million from the Premier League as revenue on top of that. So I mean, it would be an obvious way for the EFL to try to level the playing field and try to improve the standing for the majority of clubs and not just the rich minority of former Premier League clubs.
Okay, well, the other thing that we're doing in this episode of our series of financial fair play specials is we specifically asked people for their questions, and we started this as an idea of kind of doing a bit of a kind of a myth buster sort of idea of some of the perceptions people have got, but we thought, well, let's stick it out there, let's people send us their questions. Now, I think some of these are probably things that we've slightly touched upon in the things that we've talked about, but some really good questions that have come in. I'm going to start with one that's come from Richard, who is Cardington Owl, who says, and this is quite a long one, but bear with me here. So, is there anything in the current rules that would prevent Mr. Chansiri from buying, let's say, a second or third tier European club as a feeder club? Then that club buys a couple of our star players for market value. It puts money into our accounts, and then subsequently loans them back to Sheffield Wednesday. So you would think everyone wins there. Mr. Chansiri keeps his kind of prize playing assets, as do Sheffield Wednesday. We stay within FFP, and the feeder club would obviously get some investment from a new owner as well, allowing it to compete in its respective league. What are your thoughts, Peter? This is probably one for you in the first instance, from a kind of a legal point of view. Would that work? Is that allowed, or are there already things to stop that happening?
Again, I'm not a legal expert, but I wouldn't think it would be allowed because it would still be seen as a related party investment, and even if you do it at market value, you'd probably have the EFL seeing this as an obvious loophole for the clubs to use as well. So they'd probably be quite harsh on it, and again, the regulations in the EFL give them quite a large scope for interpreting what they consider to be fair market value and what they consider to be revenue that they want to recognise or not. So they could easily just say that sort of revenue we won't have that. And you saw Watford when they went up that they, I wouldn't say it's not similar, but they had the same owners. I think it was Udinese in Granada in Spain maybe. And what they did there was they loaned players from those clubs who were obviously at a higher level at that point than Watford, and then loaned them to Watford, and Watford got promoted, and that was before they had there wasn't a maximum of loans you were allowed to make at that point, which is in place now, and the EFL's moved on that, you could say, and saw that this is an obvious way of getting around the rules. So I think they'll be quite quick to move on this one, and they've sussed now that they can't wait to react and put new rules in place, and then those who've made the loophole get out of jail free. They've made the system the way now that if you do something like this, they can still hit you with the rules book and put you in trouble. So I wouldn't find it likely, to be honest. It's the short answer.
Okay, fair enough. James, I'm going to put this one to you. This comes from Rich for Peru, and a couple of questions here. Secondly, actually, the second question was: have the club been in touch with us to challenge the figures that we've used on these podcasts? Well, no, we've had no contact from the from the club, which I suggest is kind of a nod that we've probably not been too far off the mark, because I think if we were making claims that were miles off, then we probably would hear from the club. But his other question: do you think that Mr. Chansiri will consider like a legal challenge here? Can you see him trying to take the EFL to court? Could he claim that this is a constraint on trade?
Do I think he would consider it? Yes. Do I think that he would actually execute on it? And do I think we would be successful? No. And for the simple reason that, ultimately we participate in a competition, right? We choose to compete in the English Football League, and the English Football League are free to set the rules of that competition. So profit and sustainability is part of the rule set of participating in the Championship. So it's difficult to say that the way that is constructed is illegal or something that could be challenged in court, although certainly the interpretation thereof can be challenged, and that's why it took so long to issue QPR with a fine for their breach of the old FFP rules several years ago. The only kind of outlet of this is the point that he makes about constraint on trade, because Sheffield Wednesday is a limited company. We obviously have to file accounts with Companies House on an annual basis, and we have to be at least viable as a going concern, which is why each year there's a statement in the accounts to the effect that the owner has committed to continuing to put up the funds to make sure that Wednesday is viable, even though we're loss making. If he felt that the club was being unfairly treated relative to other clubs in the competition, and that was having an impact on our trading performance, he possibly could make a case, but it would be very costly. It would be a test case, and frankly, it would be very, very unlikely to be heard in court in a period that would help us anyway. So I think that's unlikely. It would be much better probably to work with the EFL, as Peter said earlier, to try and evolve and amend the regulations.
Okay, Peter, this is actually a question that I've heard a few people kind of talk about, and not just specifically this particular club, but a few others as well. So from James Chapman: how can Leeds appear to keep on spending? And it's not just Leeds. I think a few other clubs that people find it strange that they, are Derby, maybe an example of a club that's perceived to just kind of spend and spend and spend and spend. How does that work?
Player trading. If you don't do a Wednesday and sign a lot of players, you can't, for a lot of money that you can't sell for any money, you are able to do it. I mean, if you look at Derby, are obviously in trouble as well, but they're actually a lot better off than we are, because they've moved on a considerable number of players over the last couple of years, and that has improved their finances no end. And if you look at the players they have now, they obviously have a lot of old players like we do, but they also have a lot of quite a few of good young players under contract as well, and they've also managed to bring in some loan players that are really good. So they're playing the system, and Derby as well are fiddling with like weird legal constructions of companies and what have you to try and get around some of the rules, which isn't successful, by the way. But they're trying to do that as well. So Derby would. Before this close season, I'd say they're probably on the verge of breaching FFP, or profitability and sustainability. But then obviously they both sold players and sign players. So if you sell a player for a fee and you sign a player for the same fee, then it's going to make no difference to your accounts. Actually, it's going to improve your accounts, because if you sign a player on a 5-year contract, for instance, a young player, if you sign him for 5 million, he's only going to count, because of amortization, he's only going to count as an expense of £1 million in the first year of your accounts. So you actually make a £4 million profit in that case. So that's essentially why Derby just about get out of jail this summer, and I think they will probably have been in touch with the EFL as well, but have proven before that they can sell players, and they have saleable assets in their team, younger players that could later on play in the Premier League maybe and fetch large fees. So that's probably why the EFL said, okay, Derby, you're good to go. Leeds is another case. Leeds have done essentially what Wolves did the season before. they've had 3 years, 14-15, 15-16, 16-17, of just about making a profit, or I think they lost about a combined 1 million for those 3 years. So while we made a loss for 3 years, including this season, of £50 million, Leeds' loss is around £1 million, which means they've got £38 million of allowable spend this season. And I mean, obviously, if they make a loss of £38 million this season and don't go up, they could be in trouble next season unless they sell players again. Which is essentially what Wolves did. They bought players that they could essentially see as very saleable assets. I mean, Neves was if they didn't go up, Neves could be sold for let's say £30 million, and they'd have no problem with FFP or PNS, even if they weren't promoted. Leeds is the same. I mean, this is the boom and bust cycle we've been talking about before. That teams, in quotation marks, save up for a few seasons and keep the ship tight and sell off players to turn a small profit, and then go for it in one season and use the entire 3-season allowed limit of £39 million losses in one single season. That's the Wolves model, and Leeds is probably trying to do that as well. But you also have to remember, Leeds and Derby are both clubs with a higher revenue than we have, even without selling players. They have a higher average attendance. They have a lot higher commercial revenue. So they are bigger clubs financially, and probably bigger clubs full stop over the last 10 years anyway, which is probably controversial. But if you look at it,
hang on, Peter.
If you look at it,
you're going to have to interrupt your flow there. That's going to upset a lot of people. That's a highly controversial statement.
Yeah, it's just the numbers, man. What can I say?
Well, let me throw a couple of numbers back at you, because I think this is a question, James, that is worth spending time on, because there's nothing worse than the green-eyed monster, right? When you're sat as a Wednesday fan seeing all this happening to you, and you're seeing clubs up and down the road, seemingly on the path to success. Look at the players that those two clubs have sold over the last 12, 18 months. So Leeds sold Chris Wood to Burnley for what, 12 million, something like that. Charlie Taylor, big fee as well. Derby just this summer, they sold Vidra to Burnley again. Burnley have done both of these clubs pretty well, right? 7.5 million. Before that, last summer they sold Tom Ince to Huddersfield. Wednesday, I just simply have to say, when's the last player that we can remember selling for more than a few £1 million? And that's where the difference in a lot of the profit and loss accounts on a year-to-year basis come. The other thing, and this is something we don't talk about a lot, is where those clubs are situated. Quite frankly, they're situated in bigger centres of commerce, and that attracts revenue. There's more wealth in the area, which means they can bring more money into the club just naturally through commercial revenues, but also there's a lot more commercial activity, which means they can push up the revenue line through corporate entertainment, through corporate sponsorships, corporate relationships, etc. Those are the things that Wednesday have to develop if we want to be able to compete at the same level. We've got to sell players for big money, and we've got to try and develop sources of revenue outside of the Chansiri family.
James, on that, I'm going to ask you a question here that comes from John Guest. Some of this is kind of a question about kind of legal constraints, but I guess some of it relates to what you've just been talking about there. So John says, what options are open to us and the likelihood of raising income from property assets? So we're talking stadium, training ground. So he was thinking stuff like naming rights, conference facilities, a gym facility, maybe building a hotel, which was an idea that seemed to be mooted a few years ago and then never kind of went anywhere. We've kind of covered a little bit on the idea of stadium naming rights on the Wednesday week during this week, where we kind of said it's something that can happen, but if Huddersfield's stadium naming rights is £300,000 a year, and they're in the Premier League, you can kind of see the kind of numbers that we're looking at. And when we're talking about, 10 to 15 million pounds that we need to be bringing in, that's probably very little impact. But what about the other stuff? What do you think?
I mean, the simple reaction is, and this is something I've been on my hobby horse now for a number of years on, there is an enormous amount more that the club could do. I don't think the answer, frankly, is in things like naming rights for the reasons you've outlined. Fair market value will quickly catch up on that, on us with that. But there's an enormous amount more you can do if you establish the right relationship with your fan base, and if you establish the right relationship with corporate partners, and particularly if you can tap into fan bases outside of your immediate area. So I'll take each of those in turn. This fan base is remarkably loyal and has been put through the ringer over the last 18 months, 2 years, but as consistently said, we want to put our money in. We just need the right vehicles to do it. That isn't by charging top dollar for everything. It's by finding ways of helping people spend 20, 30 pounds, not 90, 100, 1,000 pounds. So let's think about what we can do with the loyal 30,000 or so in the area, and a significant more probably who don't come to every match day. The question of corporate partners is huge. The club has to find ways to tap into hospitality, into entertaining. It has to make the stadium a source of revenue, 365 days a year, and that simply isn't happening in Hillsborough at the moment. So there's an enormous amount more they could do there, and a lot about that is about the Wednesday brand and why people would want to spend time in a Sheffield Wednesday environment. And then the third part, and this is the piece that's probably closest to my heart, because obviously where I live and the people I associate with over back in America. You have to try and build fan bases and sources of income that come from outside your immediate fan base. So, a lot of other clubs, and Leeds are doing this very well, by the way, at the moment, really striking big partnerships with American sports ventures, investors, sports teams, the 49ers included. You try and find ways of striking those associations and pulling fans in from those areas. We obviously have a fan base in Thailand. My understanding is that because of other clubs that are represented there, we've been biding our time because of the hope of a Premier League platform to build that out. But we can't wait around. We have to try and do those type of things, because unless we significantly boost our income levels under the current environment, we're going to continue to run up against these problems.
Okay, I'm going to give a quick mention here to a couple of people. So Alex Watson and also Monty, who is up in Glasgow, who've asked us questions that I think we've already kind of covered, and as we're a little bit tight on time, I'm going to skip to the final question from Javo. Now, this is maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek, although actually something that comes up quite a bit. So, Peter, whether this is a possibility or not, I guess, can we just cut Abdi and get him off the wage bill? Just get rid of him. Just sack him. Can we not do that?
Yeah, if you got kicked out of your job and you had a contract that said you were supposed to get all the wages in the contract, I don't think you would be happy just being kicked out. So, so we probably have to wait till the summer to let his contract run out and let him leave. But I'm still hopeful we can loan him out. But no, it's not going to make a big difference, unfortunately.
This is where you need to be in America. You're going to have hire at will policies, right? If only Wednesday could hire a flyer out and Abdi at will.
That's just going to turn into a bad crime show, isn't it?
Maybe once we've left the EU, all employment law goes out the window. We can just sack as many players as we want. Won't matter anymore, will it?
Oh, that's true. Under Tory Britain, it's probably likely that a few years down the line you can just enslave them instead and not pay them anything.
What we'll do is we'll stick Abdi on one of the turnstiles.
Oh yeah, definitely.
We'll pay him maybe £6-7 now or something like that. Yeah, that would make a huge saving. So, guys, I mean, they're all the questions that we had in. Is there anything else that either of you two particularly wanted to get across?
Well, I have one thing, and just it's sort of like a coattail to what James was saying before. I think the problem we've had in the last 3 years under Chancery is he's built a squad, but he's failed to build a club. And this club really needs building, not rebuilding, but proper building. There isn't the infrastructure there for a club that would. I mean, even if we got to the Premier League, the infrastructure of this club, as if you remember Sam Hodgson being asked about whether things were right at the club, and he had that giant pause of maybe a minute. That's really telling that even the players can see that this club is not at the level where you would considered a Premier League club off the pitch. There are several clubs in the Championship where you would consider them Premier League clubs off the pitch, but we are not there yet. So if you're in for the long haul, that's the thing you need to get right. And that's not just about the revenue streams, that's also about building the infrastructure, having the scouting there, having the academy there at a decent enough standard that you can actually sustainably stay in the Premier League for a number of years once you get there.
Okay, as is often the case when people listen back to these podcasts, they have a load of questions off the back of them. I know, Peter, you are excellent at answering people's questions. So do you want to give us a quick plug for your Twitter if there's anyone that has anything that's, nagging away at the back of the mind and they want to sound you out about it? How would they go about that?
Yeah, sure. My Twitter is at PLOEHMANN. And yeah, as you said, I've pretty much answered everyone who's tweeted me, and sometimes at a longer length than I think they were comfortable with. But yeah, sometimes just want to get things across, and yeah, I've got quite a few bits of information that thankfully you guys help me get out there in a palatable form. But there's a lot of stuff that I've tried to pick up on and over the last half year. So if you have a question, just shoot away.
And James, I mean, it's been a couple of weeks now since we've heard your dulcet tones in your closet over in New York. And obviously you're here this week. You're in the UK this week. We are off down to Brentford together on Sunday, which will be good. Will it be the week after that you're likely to back on the Owls Americast?
I don't know. I think when you get injured in this sort of kind of highly competitive podcasting world, or if you just go on vacation, you have to wait for your chances, don't you? So I'll be training furiously. This has been an opportunity for me to try and warm up the vocal cords, and I'll hope that when I finally get back to Manhattan, which isn't for another 2 weeks, because as you say, we're off to Brentford next weekend, which I'm really looking forward to. Last trip to Griffin Park. And then I've got to go to San Diego, so I'm going to try and hang out with Neil, our San Diego owl, if I can get hold of him. I'll have to wait and see. If I get a call up, I'll be ready and raring to go. I won't be like Alman Abdi and on vacation somewhere sending Instagram photos. But you'll have to wait and see whether I ever make a reappearance.
I think it goes without saying that we will attempt to do some kind of social media stuff in Brentford, which we attempted to do in Wolverhampton at the back end of last season, but that just didn't work for a number of reasons, partly down to beer, partly down to issues with connection. But we'll try and do some bits and bobs from Brentford on Sunday. And I mean this in the nicest possible way, guys, but I really hope that we don't have any cause to speak to each other until at least January now. Hopefully, it will be a couple of quiet months in terms of our financial situation. If anything does change, we will reassemble and we will dissect it and try and figure it all out. Of course, if you want to follow the Wednesday week, we are at TWWcast, the Owls Americast over at Owls Americas. We will see how the next few months pan out, and we will probably speak to you again in January.